Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in the month of April 2026. And there were a lot of extra books that I wasn't anticipating adding to my schedule. So I will talk about those throughout this video. But I started the month by finishing A Slowly Dying Cause by Elizabeth George. This is the most recent book in her Inspector Lynley and Barbara Havers series, which is basically about two partnered police officers and the crimes that they solve. This was a very traditional police procedural, as these typically tend to be, and I would definitely recommend starting from the beginning of the series and working your way through. Then I picked up A Report for Murder. This is, I believe this is the first book. I think I read this entire series. I'm just gonna check this out. Yes, okay. So I read this entire series. It is 6 books total. It is the Lindsay Gordon series by Val McDermid. It starts with Report for Murder, and I'll talk about the other ones like as I kind of go through. It starts with Report for Murder, and then there is Common Murder. I'm just going to flip through here. Deadline for Murder, Conferences are Murder, Hostage to Murder, and then the final book is, let me see if I can find it. I must have missed one. I'll make sure that they're all up here on the screen. Booked for Murder, I think, is one that I missed. And I think they might have different titles because these were published a while ago. And so the titles you may see on the screen could be different than what I'm reading out loud. But these are books about a reporter who starts to solve crimes. And Val McDermid is a lesbian writer. This is one of her first series. It is about a lesbian reporter. So there's a lot about kind of queer culture embedded into these books. And I think that was something that was really important for Val McDermid at the time. I think there were not very many characters who were being represented this way. And so she is very intentional about kind of the elements of queer culture that she's putting into these books. And I actually really enjoyed reading like a very early series by Val McDermid. She's one of my favorite mystery writers. She's written a couple of more contemporary recent series that I just love. And I always pick up her latest books. And so to go back to kind of her early fiction and see where she started was super interesting. Then I picked up My Husband's Wife by Alice Feeney. This is a thriller mystery about a woman who goes home one day and her husband basically says he doesn't recognize her. And there's another woman who opens the door who says that she's his wife. And this one is very twisty. I will admit maybe like 60% in, I went online and looked for a plot like description of like what exactly is going on because I didn't feel like I would be able to follow it. And I think that a lot of people have said there are elements of it that are confusing. They're looking up the ending to make sure they understand what's going on. It's still good, but I think that it actually helped me a lot to understand kind of where things were going with the plot so that I knew kind of what to look for. And I felt like I was following along with it. It didn't feel like it ruined any surprises for me to look that up and kind of understand where it was going. Next, I read a book called Most of All You by Mia Sheridan. This is a book about a woman who is like an exotic dancer and a man who was kidnapped and abused when he was a child and how they begin to have a relationship with each other. And I think that Mia Sheridan, one of the things she kind of writes well is people who are kind of wounded and they find each other and they are part of each other's healing. Like there are other books of hers that I've read that are along the same lines. And I appreciated that storyline. Next, I read a book called Good Work by Paul Millard. And this is a book about a man who has basically stepped out of traditional work environments and is kind of living on his own schedule, on his own set of expectations when it comes to work, which means he has like significantly lower cost of how he's living his life. He is living internationally. He's taking on kind of like consulting work when he needs to. He is partnered with someone and they have a child and they're basically working very untraditionally. And he talks about it in this book. I always appreciate people when they share their story of how they're doing this. It's not something that I would typically or like necessarily choose for myself, but I really do like hearing about how others do it. All right, next I picked up several of the books in Rachel Reed's Game Changer series. So I had read some of these, but not all of them. I picked up Common Goal, Role Model, and then eventually The Long Game. So books 4, 5, and 6. This is a series that only has 6 books out right now, but a 7th is being published next year. And this is the set of hockey-themed queer romances that the Heated Rivalry television show is based on. I was really trying to get to the 6th book in the series because it's part 2 to book 2 in the series. It follows up on the relationship of the Heated Rivalry show. And it is what season 2 is going to be based on. So I wanted to get to book 6, so I kind of knew where all of this was headed. I love these books. I think that they're like really like they're queer positive representation. They're talking about like tackling toxic masculinity within a sport that I think, many people have recognized has been challenged to have queer representation. And every story is a little bit different. She takes on, Rachel Reed, the author, takes on a lot of different queer tropes and kind of brings them into the stories in different ways. So I'm really glad that I picked up this series, and I'm looking forward to season 2 of the show. Then I picked up a book called Imposter by L.J. Ross, and this is a series that I've been kind of wanting to start. It's the first book in the series, and a relatively traditional police procedural of this one as well. A detective kind of stepping in to solve a crime, but it sets up a main character who I actually thought was really interesting. He's like a forensic psychologist and has like this reputation for being able to like step in the minds of criminals and psychopaths and kind of profile them. And so this takes place in Ireland. I was really kind of curious to see how the series would start, and I would definitely pick up more books in the series. Then I picked up Dear Writer by Maggie Smith. Maggie Smith is a very well-regarded poet, and this is her book about writing. And she includes a lot of her poetry in the book as examples. I really liked this. I love books on writing, but I think that this book in particular, partially because I really like Maggie Smith as a poet, it was so interesting to see the behind the scenes of how she's creating her work. And I just really found it to be both interesting from the perspective of like learning about her process, but also thinking about the craft. I also read 2 books in the series that Abby Jimenez has created, which is called Say You'll Remember Me. And I read the second book, which is The Night We Met. So I had previously read Say You'll Remember Me, and then I read The Night We Met. I will say that this book, I feel like this book in particular was kind of challenging for some people, and I would put myself in the group of people that was kind of challenged by this book. This is a book about a woman who is in a relationship with a man, and she kind of like, she meets 2 men at the same time. She chooses to be in a relationship with one of these men. Then the second man, who she met at roughly the same time, basically falls in love with her, and he's like the best friend of her boyfriend. And he starts to do all of these things to kind of support her, and the partner that she is with has various issues that he's kind of working through. Don't want to give away a lot of spoilers, but they end up in this kind of like turmoil of like they become like very deep friends, and she's trying to figure out what to do with this partner, and it kind of causes a bunch of tension like all the way around. And she doesn't really understand that this other guy is kind of has been in love with her, and so he's also like struggling with this whole situation. And it just felt like one of those situations or relationships where you just should be honest with each other about what's going on. And it takes a very long time for that to happen in this book. And it just feels kind of unfair to everybody involved because of like how this is unfolding. Obviously, there's complications to these kinds of situations in real life, but it felt like this kind of just got like strung along a little bit in the book. And I would guess that some other people kind of felt this way too, based on the reviews that I've read. So not one of my favorites of Abby Jimenez. I continue to think she's very good at like plotting and kind of what she does with character development, the banter. I've read other romances by her that I've really enjoyed. This just wasn't one of my favorites. Next, I read Across the Vanishing Sky by Catherine Cowles. This is the first book in her new series called Starlight Grove. And it is about a woman whose best friend goes missing when they're out like hiking. And she ends up moving to the town where this happens and trying to track down what happened to her friend. This is like maybe a year later. And she ends up meeting someone and kind of becomes like invested in this town. She has a child, she's a single mother, and is trying to figure out like what happened to her best friend. The situation with the best friend, like we do learn what happened, by the end of this book. So that's kind of the core central mystery. And it sets up really well for book 2. So I'm looking forward to reading the next one in the series. Next, I read a book called The Gallagher Place by Julie Doerr. This is like a kind of like creepy mystery about this woman who is at this like vacation home in the woods, like a cabin. And her partner is supposed to meet her there, and then he never shows up. And she has no idea what's going on, where he is. And then all of a sudden somebody shows up on kind of the outskirts of their property, and it feels very like menacing, and she's not sure what to do because she's there by herself. And it kind of like unfurls from there in terms of what's happening in the book. I liked where this went. I thought the plot twists were kind of interesting, like they weren't what I was expecting. And I did find that Like it was like atmospherically like very engaging because of the kind of creepiness of what was happening. So I like that one. Next, I read a book called Nobody Knows You're Here by Bryn Greenwood. And this is a book about a woman who basically gets kidnapped, taken to a house where she's supposed to take care of children. And we're not quite sure what's going on with these children other than they've been kidnapped too. And it's like all very strange that she's like in this house having to take care of these kids. And eventually we find out what's going on. And she has to basically try to escape, like what the situation is. This was a very creative book. Like it was not what I was anticipating. And I read the first book by this author and kind of struggled with some of the themes of the first book. But this one was a little bit easier for me in terms of just kind of like where she took the plot and the character development. So I would pick up another book by her. Then I read Yesteryear by Caro Claire Burke. This is the book that everybody is talking about. It is about a trad wife influencer who wakes up one morning and she's like in 1855 and it has to figure out how to survive when she, in her trad wife influencer life, is like basically emulating the late 1800s or the mid 1800s. And now she's actually in this time period and having to live there. And it was super interesting. I think that some people don't like the ending. I actually really liked the ending. I thought it was like, it made sense kind of for what was happening in the book. And I feel like it added a lot of complexity. This is definitely a book club book in terms of like wanting to discuss it after you're done reading it. Then I picked up a book called Missing Sam by Thridi Umrigar. And this is a book about two women who are married, and one of them goes out for a run one morning and she goes missing. And the remaining wife is like obviously trying to find her, trying to figure out what happened. She comes under suspicion because they'd kind of been fighting about something. And then we do find out from the perspective of the woman who goes missing, like what happened to her. And there's a lot of like resolution that's coming, you know, with what happened to her. And I don't want to give anything away. I'll just say we find out what happened to her. And there are multiple perspectives that tell this story. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about this is the woman who is left behind in the marriage of the woman who's the partner who goes missing and then she's remaining, is a woman of color. And she's kind of dealing with the cultural components of her family accepting her kind of queer identity. And that becomes like a much bigger storyline later in the book, which I really appreciated how that was handled. And I thought it was handled in a really sensitive way. So I really like that part. Okay, next I read another Mia Sheridan called Becoming Calder. And this is a book about like basically teenagers who are living in a cult-like setting. And there is a cult leader who is basically abusive. And he brings this girl into their environment and is planning to marry her when she comes of age. But she's basically being primed to be his wife from a young age. And this girl ends up having feelings for and kind of romantic feelings for another boy who's living in this environment. And they're trying to kind of like figure out how to be together and potentially run away. I found this book to be strange. Like, I think that it feels like it's both taking place in kind of like a contemporary environment that should be more familiar, but also in this environment that feels almost like fantasy and like not, you know, in a real environment. And I found that to be like hard to get over for me. Like it was almost like it was like metaphorical or something in some way, rather than being kind of like a real situation that these people were dealing with. And there are other books in this series. I don't necessarily think I would pick them up. I've liked other Mia Sheridans, but not necessarily this one. The next book I picked up is called The Bodyguard Affair by Amy Lee. This is a book about a woman who works as like a staff member of a politician and his wife. And she writes a romance novel about like this staff member having a romance with the politician, which is obviously fictional, but people find out that she's the one who wrote it. And so she has to end up having this fake relationship with one of the bodyguards. And this is why it's called The Bodyguard Affair. I thought this was really cute. It's basically, you know, a story about a woman and a man who've actually met each other previously. And then they kind of have to fall into this relationship because of what's going on with her, her romance novel. And I liked it. I thought it was well plotted. I liked the character development, and I thought that the chemistry between the two main characters was great. Next, I picked up a book called The Boy in the Striped Pajamas by John Boyne. This one is hard to describe except to say it takes place in World War II. It takes place next to a concentration camp, and it is basically about two boys who meet across the fence. To go much further into like what happens in this book is, I think it would give a lot away. But to say like the ending is horrifying. And there are a lot of trigger warnings for like children in peril. And if you struggle with reading books about concentration camps or World War II, this might not necessarily be a book for you. This was made into a film. I do want to watch the adaptation just to kind of see how this was done. And I'm really glad I picked this up. But I do think, and there was like an interview at the end with the author, which I also really appreciated. But I do think that this may be a book that is hard to read and hard to process for people. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be read, but just noting that this was kind of a tough one. Next, I read a book called High Functioning by Judith Joseph. And this is a book basically about people who have a form of depression that this author has coined high functioning depression. And she gives certain characteristics of what this can look like. It reminded me a little bit of the author who talks about highly sensitive people. And people might say like, well, that just sounds like neurodivergence. But she's basically saying it's a different thing. It's not the same thing as neurodivergence. This author is kind of saying this high functioning depression is like a version of depression, but it's not the same thing. And I think that, you can interpret these things as happening at different levels or happening at different kind of severities. But I feel like these things are all kind of on a similar spectrum to each other. I did find the book interesting. I work with a lot of people in my coaching practice who have things like burnout. And so this was also helpful for me to think about in that context as well. Next, I picked up a book called The Ending Writes Itself by Evelyn Clark. This is a newer book that just came out about a bunch of writers who get taken to an island and they're in competition with each other to finish the book of a writer who has just died, and they all start getting killed off. And I think that this was super smartly written. You get a number of different POVs of the different characters and the different kinds of writing that they do. They all have different genres that they're working in. And I just thought this was super smart. This author, I didn't realize this, is a pen name, and I'm wondering if this is in here. Yeah, so this is a pen name for Kat Clark and V.E. Schwab, which I did not know when I picked this up. I love V.E. Schwab's work. I'm less familiar with the other author, but now I'm like extra glad that I read this because I really like the other novels I read by that author. Next, I picked up a short story by Catherine Center called Everybody's Favorite Guy, and this is basically about two people, a man and a woman, who have like a connection when they're in high school, and then the woman is rejected by the man, and they're like, their parents are friends, so they get kind of like thrown back together at different points. And as adults, the woman comes to understand why she was rejected by this man, and they end up, in a relationship together. This short story was really cute. I like Catherine Center a lot, so it was just kind of fun to pick that up. The next book I picked up is called All Superheroes Need Photo Ops. This is the second book in the Supers in the City series by Elizabeth Stevens. One thing that I was not anticipating about this book is it turns into kind of like this subgenre of romance, which you may or may not have heard of, which involves basically like monsters and humans. And I didn't get this as much from the first book. The first book in the series basically felt like a superhero who was kind of like an enhanced human being in a relationship with a woman. And so it was like very similar to like, Superman and Lois Lane, kind of thing. This book actually turns into like this superhero has something that happens to him that basically like enhances his body in particular ways where he becomes kind of monstrous. And this, I think, turned it into a book that kind of falls into this subgenre of like monster romance. I have not read a lot of things in this subgenre. I have heard of it. I'm aware of it. I know of certain books that are very popular in this subgenre, and I'm not sure it's for me. I'll just say, like, I think that when it started going in that direction, I was like, okay, this is strange. Like, it moved into a direction that I was not anticipating. And I don't know that I would pick up another book, in that subgenre or necessarily in this series because of the direction that it took. So that was kind of disappointing because I really liked the first book in the series, and I found the second book to move in kind of an odd direction. Next, I picked up a book called Wolf Hour by Jo Nesbø. This is the first book set in the United States by this Scandinavian mystery writer who is very famous for the kind of noir type books that he writes. He has a long running series, and this is not using the same characters from that series. This is a standalone. It's set in Minnesota. It actually brings in a lot of like racial politics of the United States. I was not necessarily anticipating that, but it makes sense, based on when the story was set. And it really, like, I appreciated going back into the world of this writer. I trust this writer a lot. I've read a lot of his other books. I think they're very good. And it actually made me want to revisit his original series, which I got sucked into many, many years ago. So I'll probably go back and read some books from that series and kind of like dip back into it. Next, I picked up a book called The Shots You Take. This is a standalone by Rachel Reed of the Game Changers series fame that I mentioned earlier in the video. And this is a book about two men who play hockey together. They have kind of a relationship where one of the men identifies as gay and the other man identifies as maybe questioning, but I think he thinks he's straight. And then later in life, he realizes he is not. And so it is about kind of them coming back together later in life when they're older adults and kind of like mid-career in terms of like what they're doing with hockey and other kinds of jobs that they are engaging in. And having to, I think they're in like their early 40s or maybe their late 30s at this point, and having to like reconcile what happened earlier in their relationship and decide if they want to continue to have a relationship with each other given like those ups and downs. I liked this book. I didn't like it as much as the other series, the Game Changer series, but I thought it was solid. Next, I read the 12th book in Nevada Barr's series that is called Anna Pigeon. And this series is basically a set of mysteries that all take place in national parks across the United States. And this one is in Yosemite National Park. And I really like this series a lot. This one in particular I enjoyed because it is basically taking Anna Pigeon, who's the primary main character, into like the wilderness, and she has to have like this survival narrative because of like she goes after these criminals and then they go after her and she's like trying to survive in the wilderness. And I love wilderness survival stories. And so I got completely sucked into this. I will definitely keep reading the other books in the series. I think I have about half a dozen left before I finish it. And so I want to get back to reading those. All right, then I ended up getting sucked into a series that I wasn't anticipating, and it is called The Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon. There are 8 volumes. This is by Beth Brower. This is a series basically about a woman who is in her early 20s, and some people have compared this to like, if you like Jane Austen, you would like this. This takes place in like the late 1800s. And she has returned to like this neighborhood in London. And she has this cousin who is basically trying to sabotage her, both financially and otherwise. And she has this group of people who kind of come around her. There's all these varying characters that we learn about throughout the 8 volumes. And across like the first few volumes, we get introduced to these different men who we're pretty sure are going to be like her suitors, but we're not sure like what's going to happen with that. And this is all told through her journals. So you get kind of like these journalistic entries day by day. There's like a date, and then you get this journal entry. She's also very bookish and likes to read. And so you hear her like collecting books throughout this series as well. You can imagine why this is like checking all of my boxes. So I ended up reading all 8 volumes. The first few of these are almost like novellas. They're very short. I happen to have all of these available on audio to me. So I listened to them like really, really quickly. And then as you go later in the series, like the last couple of books are more like a novel length. But I basically spent through these and read them back to back in the month of April. So it added a lot of books to my list that I wasn't anticipating. Another book that I picked up is called March by Geraldine Brooks. This tells the story of the father in Little Women, who goes to war in that book. If you're familiar with the Book of Little Women, it is about 4 sisters and their mother, and how they're basically surviving without their father who has gone to war. And this is the story of like his experience during the time of the book. And I love Little Women. I love the books that were written after Little Women. And so this was like super fun to dig into this story. And I really appreciated this. I thought it was really creative of the author. Next, I read a book called And Now Back to You by B.K. Borison. I have found that B.K. Borison's books are very hit or miss for me. I either love them or I really don't like them. I happen to really like this one, so that is good news. This is the second book in a series called Heartstrings. And it tells the story of two rival meteorologists who go to cover a snowstorm, and they get kind of stuck in this inn and have a romance with each other. And I thought this was super cute. Loved the banter, loved kind of like the weather components of this. I thought that was really kind of a fun element. And I don't know if there will be other books in this series, but if there are, I would definitely pick them up. Next, I read a book called How to Get Away with Murder. This is by Rebecca Phillipson. And I thought this was super creative. It goes back and forth in points of view between a female detective and a man who has written a book called How to Get Away with Murder, where he's talking about his past history as a serial killer and telling other people how to successfully kill people. And she's obviously trying to track him down and find him with like the facts that he has put into this book. And so you're kind of like following along as she's like following these clues of what's in this book. I thought this was super creative. It was really interesting. I don't think I've read anything else by this author. I'm not sure what else that they have written, but I would definitely dig into a backlist, or if this is a debut, would read any other books that they write. I thought it was really fun. Next, I read Her Last Breath by Taylor Adams. I loved this book. It is such a good thriller. It's about two women who go caving together, and people have described this book over and over again as claustrophobic because all of this stuff happens in the caves. And it's so hard to go into this without like giving away spoilers. But basically the book opens up with one of these women surviving the situation in the caves and a detective interviewing her. And you hear this interview happening kind of throughout the book. You have three different perspectives. One of the women who survives, another woman who's in the cave with her, and then this man who kind of like approaches them as they're entering the cave. And he ends up having a POV through part of this book as well. I thought this was great. I like sped through it. I feel like I listened to the audiobook in like one sitting, and I would highly, highly recommend this if you like thrillers. I think you'd really enjoy this, and I would love to see this adapted into a movie or a show. Next, I read a book called Whitby by T. Kira Madden. This is a book that comes with a lot of trigger warnings because it is primarily about three women who are tied to a male character who is a child sex abuser. And one of the women, well, actually two of the women are his victims, and one of the women is his mother. And I'm trying to figure out what I can say and what I can't say to not give something away. Just, I would say at a high level, this is a book about trauma. This is a book about recovering from trauma or kind of dealing with trauma. And I think that depending on kind of the trigger warnings that you typically pay attention to, you would want to be kind of thoughtful going into this book. I did think this book was very sensitive and really well done in terms of how it talks about these kinds of themes. It did not feel salacious. It did not feel like it was disrespectful of, people who have gone through this experience. And I thought the author writes a lot of the components of this book in a really beautiful way. I'm glad I picked it up. Next, I read a book called In Your Dreams by Sarah Adams. This is the fourth book in the When in Rome series, which is a set of romances that are all based off of, what is her name? An actress, the films of a particular actress. And let me see if it's in the description. Okay, I found it. All of the books are based off of Audrey Hepburn films, or they're kind of inspired by them. And I really like that element of it. Of this entire series, book 2 was my favorite, and by far my favorite. I think the other ones were okay. I'm glad that I finished the series, but I really like book 2 the most. Next, I picked up a book called This Story Might Save Your Life by Tiffany Crum. This is a story of two podcasters, and one of the podcasters goes missing, and we're spending the entire book trying to figure out what happened to them. And it takes an interesting turn that made a lot of sense in terms of the plot, but wasn't necessarily what I was expecting, and I really enjoyed it. And I think that the podcasting elements made this really fun to listen to on audio because it does have different production quality when you're listening to elements of the podcast. So I would definitely recommend that one on audio. All right, just a couple more. The next book I read is called I Spy by L.M. Kemp. This is an advanced reader's copy of a book that is coming out, I believe, in early May. And it is about a woman who is a spy, and then she becomes a mother, and she basically drops out of being a spy for 5 years, and then she gets pulled back in. So she is now pulled back into being a spy, and she has a child who's 5 years old. She is also the daughter of a spy and was basically raised to be a spy by her mother and is traumatized by that and is trying to keep her child away from the spy business, even as she's getting sucked back into it. I really like this book a lot. If it is the beginning of a series, I would totally pick up more. I loved the way the characters were set up in this. And when she goes back into being a spy, there's all these people that are kind of around her that are from her like old spy days, and she gets to like reconnect with them. There's also, of course, like stuff about like spy tools and technology, which is always really fun. And this had, you know, a couple twists that I really saw coming, but it didn't take away from like the overall like fun components of this book. The last book that I read is one called Quietly Yours by L.H. Causeway. This is the third book in the Quiet Love series, and I believe there's 4 books total in this series. And this one in particular is about a man who is basically very wealthy, and he's also like a curmudgeon. He's very grumpy, and he has what is the right way to describe this? Okay, so his mother is married to a man who is not his father. So this is his stepfather. And the stepfather has a daughter. So they are not related, but they are connected by their parents. And something happens to the parents, and he gets kind of thrown together with this other woman. And she ends up, basically, she was living with these parents and kind of caretaking for them. He was estranged from them. And something happens to them, and he basically like kicks her out of this house and makes her homeless, and then realizes he has made her homeless, feels bad about it, and has her move into one of his like properties, because of course he's rich and he has many properties. Then they begin to get to know each other, and eventually they have a relationship. In this series, I would say of all the books I've read so far, book 1 was my favorite, book 2 was my second favorite, and this one is kind of, I wouldn't say a distant third, but definitely third. I'm curious about book 4 and what I will think about that. But I found this book to be a little bit challenging because this character is like so gruff. And eventually the woman is basically like attracted to that, like the fact that he's like kind of just a jerk. And that was something that was a little bit hard for me, that was something that she just kind of accepted and found to be like part of his like attraction. And so that was a turnoff for me in terms of like how he treats people and like how she eventually came to like that. But I do think that this author is doing like a fine job of like pairing up different tropes and like thinking about these relationships in different ways. And I will definitely pick up book 4 just to kind of see what I think of it. So those are all of the books that I read in April of 2026. I hope you'll hang around for my May TBR video to see what I plan to read in this upcoming month. And until then, happy reading.